So let me get this straight. You need my help to save you from a bunch of hairy aliens with a bad attitude. Just point me in the right direction. I'll have this settled in no time.
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So those of you who have been following my channel recently will know that in my last video I reviewed Duke Nukem Total Meltdown for the PS1 from 1997. For those of you who don't know, that game is essentially a PS1 port of the original Duke Nukem 3D from the previous year. Today we're going to be looking at another Duke Nukem game for the PS1, Duke Nukem Land of the Babes, released in the year 2000, developed by 3D Realms and N-Space. So Duke Nukem Land of the Babes is an interesting one for several reasons. It came out at a pretty weird time for the Duke Nukem series, with Duke Nukem Forever being officially announced as the fourth game in the mainline series, still in development, and with the release date for it constantly being pushed back and delayed due to the problems it faced during its development. Fans of the series were starting to lose patience. In the meantime, there were several spin-off Duke games, released across various different platforms, meant to capitalise on the license until the mainline series continued. One of those spin-off games was this game, Land of the Babes. This game is actually a direct sequel to the 1998 game, Duke Nukem Time to Kill, also for the PS1. But I've never actually played that game since it's very rare nowadays, so I can't really comment on it. This game I bought years ago from a gaming store that no longer exists, and despite having the game in my collection for years, I've only just now completed it for the first time. For those of you who don't know, this game is generally regarded by Duke fans as one of the worst, if not the worst game in the entire series. It's a game that got panned critically on its release, and to this day it's a game that most Duke fans don't talk about. So how did I see this game? Let's talk about it. So the game is a third-person action-adventure game with some platforming mechanics. The story of the game is a bizarre one, even by Duke Nukem standards. The game takes place in a post-apocalyptic future where an alien race has taken over Earth, wiped out all of Earth's men, and enslaved all of Earth's women. This leads to a group of rebel babes starting a resistance movement called the UBR, or the United Babe Resistance. Realising that they can't defeat the aliens themselves, the UBR use a time machine to go back in time and fetch Duke Nukem, bringing him to the future in order to defeat the aliens and save the world.
Messes with my babes and Liz.
Duke, thank goodness you received our message.
The aliens have also created several new types of enemies, including a race of mutated pig cop gorilla hybrids, as well as several others. Duke will of course have to traverse the game, kick the aliens' asses and save the babes. Like I said, it's a bizarre plot.
You aliens are all the same, stupid and clumsy, and after I dispose of you all, I'll single-handedly repopulate this planet.
The game consists of 14 levels, each with their own visual style and aesthetic, just like in Duke 3D. The levels are somewhat maze-like with several twists and turns, some backtracking here and there, and plenty of variety. You get a training tutorial in the menu that basically gives you an introduction into the game's overall controls and gameplay mechanics, such as the shooting and combat, platforming mechanics, and even swimming. Each level has a whole bunch of enemies to fight, as well as some secret areas and plenty of collectibles. The shooting mechanics of the game are a bit of a mixed bag. You can shoot enemies from the hip, or you can enter into a free targeting mode. This is useful for picking off enemies from long range. You also have a lock-on system that works well for the most part, but the problem is that it can sometimes be a bit unpredictable. For example, you could be in the middle of locking onto an enemy who is close to you and shooting them. Then all of a sudden, for no apparent reason, your lock-on will start targeting another enemy who's almost out of range, leading to the enemy you were originally locking onto shooting you. This can be very frustrating at times. Some enemies also take way too long to bring down, even when using some of the most powerful guns in the game, and this can lead to some really annoying cheap deaths, as well as just generally making fights last longer than they should. It's not a massive issue, but it's a minor annoyance. As far as weapons, you have a huge variety of them in the game, For example, you start off with Duke's signature golden pistol that you see in several Duke games, which looks pretty cool and it's basically the standard weaker gun of the game. You also have a badass combat shotgun, a laser blaster which is rapid fire, a laser Gatling gun, a mini laser Gatling gun, a flamethrower for lighting enemies on fire, a grenade launcher for blowing up enemies, although sadly this gun is a pain in the ass to use as its accuracy is terrible. Speaking of the grenade launcher, so many enemies in the game use them, and this is so annoying, but I digress. An RPG, which is probably the most powerful weapon in the game, of course for blowing up enemies. You have a torpedo launcher which can only be used underwater that is very powerful. An energy weapon, some quirky weapons such as a freezer for freezing enemies and then of course smashing them to pieces Duke style, and a shrinker for shrinking down enemies and stomping them with Duke's mighty foot. You also have a sniper rifle which of course can be used to pick off enemies from long range. So many interesting and effective weapons to find throughout the game. You also have an item called a stealth generator which can be used to rescue babes. You also have a throwing knife that Duke carries around for the entire game. This is pretty weak and is only really useful if you run out of ammo in all your guns. Plus if you want to conserve ammo, you can use it to open crates sometimes containing useful items like ammo or health. In addition to these powerful weapons, you also have pipe bombs, which are basically throwing remote grenades, as well as dynamite. These are very powerful. Just be careful of your own explosions. So there's plenty of variety in terms of the game's weapons and combat. One feature they added in this game is that during combat you can replenish Duke's health by defeated enemies. In addition to the combat, the game also has a whole bunch of platforming sections, and these are a pain in the ass. The game's controls are incredibly stiff and sluggish, and the physics are downright terrible. This isn't so bad during the shooting sections, but when it comes to platforming, the game just doesn't suit it. There are so many sections of the game where you have to jump, climb and jostle your way through some of the most poorly designed levels I've ever seen, and this really highlights some of the problems with the game's controls. The jumping is incredibly unresponsive, the game has several clipping and collision detection problems, and in addition to how broken, awkward and flat out frustrating these platforming sections are, they also look extremely ugly due to the game's graphics and presentation being generally pretty poor, and the platforming just looks and feels so out of place in a game like this. The game also has plenty of swimming, and there are even whole levels that take place underwater. Now I don't usually mind underwater levels in video games, if they're done right. Sometimes they can really do their bit to vary the gameplay in my opinion, and I don't usually mind them. But sadly the underwater levels here are an absolute nightmare. The slow, clunky controls are put on really focused display here, and these sections of the game are a complete chore to play. So while the shooting mechanics and combat are okay for the most part despite some minor flaws, the platforming and underwater sections of the game are awful. The game does have some turret sections, and these were fine, I had no real problem with them. They did their bit to vary the gameplay. As I mentioned before, levels have secret hidden areas, as well as collectibles and weapons to find, useful items and even quest items. You also have night vision goggles that help you see in the dark. This can be very useful at times. And my personal favourite item, the jetpack. The jetpack is awesome and it's great fun to use, but these are few and far between. The game also has several boss battles. I found these really challenging personally. Some of the hardest bosses in any Duke game in my personal opinion, or at least that was my experience with them. The best thing about the game by far, and the thing that kept me playing and helped me see it through to the end, was the dialogue and voice acting.
I'm afraid this is the end of the line for you.
Yada yada yada, like I've never heard this before. Prepare to die, pain and suffering, you will not succeed. You'd think that you guys could get some original lines.
This is actually a much more story-driven game than most Duke Nukem games, and the game is filled with cutscenes, dialogue, and the game constantly reminds you of what's at stake. While it's not the most interesting plot, and if truth be told it's kinda stupid, the voice acting and the humour does its bit to keep you interested. Duke is of course once again voiced by the legendary John St. John, and his voice acting is fantastic as usual.
Duke, I received a coded message from Houston. I'm so glad you rescued her. The Unified Babe Resistance is forever in your debt.
No problem, Jane. I like it when babes owe me favors.
Duke gets so many one-liners in this game, and some of them are genuinely quite funny.
I was called here to save Earth's future and get humankind back on top of the food chain where it belongs. And a bunch of hairy, smelly, mutated, banana-sucking apes aren't gonna stop me. Least of all you.
The game also has its usual immature Duke Nukem humour throughout.
Are you up for getting a little wet?
Hey, isn't that my line?
So yeah, as frustrating as the game is, and as dumb as the game's plot gets, at least Duke genuinely feels like classic Duke, and this is appreciated by me. One weird thing about the game's story is that the main villain, Silverback, isn't actually in the game much, and once you defeat him, the story gets a little bit muddled.
And once I dispose of you, we will be done with this.
The game's ending is also really ridiculous. Just a really dumb ending. So that's pretty much all I have to say about Duke Nukem Land of the Babes. I give this game a disappointing 3 out of 10. There were some good ideas and some fun to be had with the game, but for the most part the game is a chore to play and I think a 3 is a fair score. Thanks for watching guys. Let me know what you guys think. Stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.
Now it's time for some serious R&R, Duke style.